Shalom, everyone. I know it's time for another video this week. Our portion is actually falling on the Shabbat of the last day of Sukkot, or Shemini Atzeret, or Simchat Torah, whatever you want to call it. It's called by different names. So this last portion is called Vezot HaBrachah, which is and this is the blessing. It is considered a unique parsha because, like I said, it's not really read on Shabbat, but it's read on the Shabbat of the last Shabbat of Sukkot. Um, and this day is called Shemini Atzeret or Simchat Torah. And it's called Simchat Torah, rejoicing in the Torah, because the Torah is finished and it's rolled back for another year. And, this is happening on Monday evening. And I want to, go through this parsha. So first of all, in Deuteronomy chapter 33 and verse 1, this is the blessing that Moshe, the man of Elohim, spoke over the people of Israel before his death. And this is the only place in the Torah where we really see that Moshe is called a man of Elohim. And it's actually a common phrase that we find elsewhere in scripture. And it's the phrase that's used to refer to like a prophet, or, as a title given to them. So let's look at a couple of those places. Let's go to 1 Kings in chapter 13 and verse 1. 1 Kings 13, verse 1. Just then, as Jeroboam was standing at the altar to burn incense, a man of Elohim came out of Yehudah, directed to Beit El by a word from Yah. We also see it in chapter 17 of 1 Kings and verse 18, where it says, she said to Eliyahu, "What do you have against me, you man of God? Did you come to me just to remind me how sinful I am by killing my son?" So this man of God phrase is used in reference as a title that's given to prophets a lot of times. And in Hebrew, this phrase is called Ish Elohim. Okay, Ish Elohim. And so here we see Moses is basically being called by this title that is given to prophets. And we can see that confirmed in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 34 in verse 10, where it says, "Since that time there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moshe, whom Yah knew face to face." And so, that title is applied to him, as well as him giving the name of a prophet. He's called a prophet. Now, when we go to Psalms, there's one psalm that is actually attributed, that I know of for a fact, to Moshe, and that is Psalms 90. Psalms 90 in verse 1, it even says, "A prayer of Moshe, the man of Elohim," Ish Elohim. "Yah, you've been my dwelling place in every generation." So again, this is the one, it is referring to him as a man of Elohim. Now, let's go back to the Parsha, and I'm going to go back to chapter 33, verse 4. And it says, "The Torah that Moshe commanded to us as an inheritance for the community of Yaakov." That's the way the complete words. And I want to look at another version and how they word it. And it says, Moshe commanded to us Torah, an inheritance for the congregation of Jacob. And, looking at those two versions, let those words really sink in, that the Torah is an inheritance for us, or a possession for us and the congregation. And it's entrusted to the congregation of Yaakov. Yaakov, we know, is renamed Israel. So, and what I find interesting is that the word that's used for inheritance here, typically the word in Hebrew for inheritance is nahalah, like Nahalot Achim, which was the neighborhood we used to live in. And it was related to the word Nahal, which means a river. So when you think about a river as something that's flowing down, or it's passing along, it's going down like a mountain or something. But with Nahal or Nahala, it is, inheritance is something you're thinking about passing down. But yet that's not the word that is used here. The Hebrew word that is actually used here is the word morashah. And morashah comes from Yerusha. And Yerusha is from the root Yarash, which means to take possession. So it refers to something that, you might have the legitimate title for, but you still have to do a positive action to acquire it. Now, I was looking through some information, and a Midrash explains it this way, like a hereditary title, like a duke or earl, is being passed down. Just like you might have a family business that's being passed down. And the difference is that, with your title being passed down, you don't do anything to inherit that title. It's just given to you. But for your family business to still be in business, it requires work. It requires you, to put hard work in there to be successful. And so even though they're both an inheritance, one is thought of, you're not doing anything, you're just gaining that title, whereas the other one, you're having to work at it to keep that inheritance. And it's interesting that that's the word that is chosen to use here for the Torah. The Torah is given to us not just as something that is just going to be handed down to us, but it is something that's more as a heritage. It belongs to the family, but it requires action in order for it to be successful, for it to be preserved for future generations. Now, the sages themselves actually put it this way, and it's pretty beautiful. And they say, Moshe commanded us the Torah as an inheritance, a morashah of the congregation of Yaakov, not read as inheritance, but betrothed. They're saying that it's actually, instead of morashah, it should be read meorashah, which is betrothed. And by this simple change in pronunciation, with the shin being turned into a sin, that's the change of the Hebrew letters. The sound is going from the sh to a s sound, that it is actually moving it from the word morashah to morasah, which is betrothal. And that the rabbis signal that there's even an inheritance relationship between the Torah and, they say, the Jew, but the former has to be loved and it is earned. So it's really interesting that they're saying that it's also, it possibly can be pronounced instead of morashah, meorasah, which is betrothed, that the Torah is giving to you as your betrothal. Now, we continue on with Moshe's blessings, and it goes into the blessings over the individual tribes. And, I've started some of the tribe studies. If you're interested in that, going to the playlist for the studies on the tribes, and you can see each one of the tribes I've been going through and going more in depth with those. So prior to his death, Yaakov had blessed each of his sons according to his son's individual potential and their destiny. And now we're reading about Moshe, that he's going to bless the tribes. And as he blesses the descendants of Yaakov's sons, he's getting specific with each one of these. And, the tribes as a whole have been given the Torah. And they're being now sent into the promised land, across the Jordan, into the promised land that they're going to, conquer and occupy. And each one is blessed according to their personality and their responsibilities. And so a lot of times these translations of the blessings vary substantially. Even the Hebrew language scholars are challenged, as there are Hebrew words and phrases in these blessings that really appear nowhere else in Scripture. And it's one of those places in the Hebrew Scriptures, well, there are some differences also within the Hebrew manuscripts. One of the modern scholars, Hebrew scholars, Jeffrey Tegay, puts it like this. He says, it is full of rare words, syntactic difficulties, grammatical inconsistencies, and opaque allusions. And so with that said, let's start going into some of those blessings. But before we begin, let's look at the blessings as a whole, because there are some obvious problems that one incurs when studying their order. First of all, when you look at down this list up in Deuteronomy, there seems to be one tribe that's totally missing, and that is Simeon or Shimon. Also, when you look at the order of these blessings seem to be in a random sequence because it starts with Reuben, Yehuda, Levi, Benjamin, Joseph, Zebulun, Issachar, Gad, Dan, Naphtali, and Asher. And that is definitely not in the order of their birth. Because Reuben's the firstborn, but then Yehuda's the next blessing, but he's the fourth child. And Levi is the next blessing, and he's the third child. And then we get to Benjamin, well, he's the 12th. So it's really interesting, when you look at the position of the blessing as opposed to the position of their birth. And even when you look at the order of the mothers, that doesn't seem to, in a way, line up because you start off with Reuben and Yehuda and Levi are all Leah's children. But then you get to Benjamin and Joseph, which are next, and they are Rachel's children. And then you go to Zebulun, which they are Leah's children. Zebulun and Issachar are Leah's. And then you go to Gad, which is Zilpah, and then Dan is Bilhah, and Naphtali is Bilhah, and then you have Asher, which is Zilpah's. So it's not in order by birth, their birth months or by mother. So that's really interesting. And also, when you look at those, we have Ephraim and Manasseh are linked together and called by Joseph here. So, as you go through that list, it's, there's lots of questions that arise as to why this order. And like I said, there's not a clear definition as to my mother, birth order, or anything like that. So there's a lot of, questions that come up. And there's been lots of midrashes and discussions on why that is so. And we'll talk about a little bit of that. But with these two groups, it seems like, why do you start with Reuben, who is the oldest, but then you skip to the fourth child? And then you've got Benjamin, who is the last child, and he's preceding Joseph. And so all of these questions are coming up. And, the one that I seem to hold with is that when you look at even how that they are listed, even around how they camped around the Mishkan, the tabernacle, it doesn't align up with that either. So, like I said, it appears to be random, but I tend to look at it this way. I think there is a logical sequence behind it. I think it is, what is the purpose and the nature of these blessings, and to what end is it? For example, Yaakov blessed his children when Yaakov blessed them, it was in the order of their age. Okay, he blessed them in their birth order. But with Moshe here, he's not their father. And here he is wanting to bless the tribes. He is their leader. He is the one that is guiding them to bring them into the land. And we know that Yahshua is going to actually bring them into the land so that they're about to go into and conquer and occupy. So I think it has to deal with how they're going into the land and how they are, these blessings are going to reflect the setting and the circumstances of them coming into the land, like the military conquest and, the function and the leadership of each tribe. So as we go through them, I think it's about that order, and I'll come back to that. But let's look at Deuteronomy 33, verse 6. It's, like I said, I think each one of these blessings also are talking about the characteristics of these tribes and their roles in the conquest of the land. So in Deuteronomy 33, 6, it says, "Let Reuben live and not die out, even though his numbers grow few." So it seems pretty short and sweet, but what does that mean? Moshe blesses the tribe of Reuben with life, let them live. Um, so there's a bit of grace and blessing in this, as because remember, Reuben was the one who slept with his father's concubine. And so, and when we go back to the Torah in Leviticus 20 in verse 11, it says, then a man who goes to bed with his father's wife has disgraced his father, and both of them should be put to death. So this is, grace that's being extended to Reuben. And, I think now perhaps the reason of why he was pardoned for this offense was that the Torah had not necessarily been given from Mount Sinai yet, and that there may be other reasons for blessing Reuben with life. Remember, Reuben had already been given territory on the east side of the Jordan. And, one of the things I think about here too was, they're on the east side. And was Moshe concerned that the tribe of Reuben would not survive because they're not in the promised land? They're outside of that land. And so he's, basically blessing them with life here, even though, he's realizing their numbers are probably going to be few. Why? Because when people are coming in to attack Israel, they're going to be on the outskirts. They're going to be one of the first ones that are probably going to be attacked. And that they may not survive. The Jewish sages offer, like a military explanation for this. In return for the land on the east side of the Jordan, the Reubenite men had promised, of course, to take the front line in the battles to conquer the promised land. And so, he's also saying, well, you know what, for us to even go into the land, they're going to be on the front line. So they may not survive. So this is a blessing for them to have that life, because this is going to be probably a dangerous mission. Now, next in 33:7 of Yehuda, he said, hear Yah, the cry of Yehuda, bring him in to his people and let his own hands defend him, but you help him against his enemies. So Yehuda, the main tribe of the Jews, is also, later the southern kingdom. And it seems here that Moshe is asking, for help in a time of war for Yehuda and in the latter days for Jews, because it starts out, of Judah, Yehuda, he's saying, hear Yah, Shema, to hear the voice of Yehuda. Because, well, why would Yah have to hear Yehuda's voice? Because they're crying out. And why would they be crying out unless there was something afflicting them? And we can certainly see that Yah has blessed, today, even Jews with military strength since gaining their statehood in 1948. And there, are numerous stories of battles, that miracles have happened, in those battles. And Yah's help has been the reason for one of the reasons for their survival. Daily, Jews are praying for the regathering of all of Israel. The kibbutz galiot, or the gathering of the exiles, is actually the 10th blessing of the Amidah prayer that is said daily. And that is where they make an appeal to Yah to return Israel from the affliction of the exile. And it said, sound the great shofar for our freedom and raise a banner to gather our exiles and unite us together from the four corners of the earth. Blessed are you, Yah, who regathers the scattered of his people Israel. So it's interesting that is part of the blessing to hear, and they're praying for the scattered of Israel to return. Now the Levites, who were the set apart, priests and teachers and musicians in the temple, are also given a rather long blessing that focused on their ability to provide that spiritual leadership. And the tribe of Levi is scattered throughout all of the tribes, the various tribes, in order to serve as teachers in the land. And so you had these Levitical cities all throughout. So Deuteronomy 33 and verse 8. Of Levi, he said, let your Tumim and your Urim be with your pious one, whom you tested at Massa, with whom you struggled at Meribah spring. Of his father and mother, he said, I don't know them. He didn't acknowledge his brothers or children, for he observed your word and he kept your covenant. They will teach Yaakov your rulings, Israel your Torah. They will set incense before you and hold burnt offerings on your altar. Yah bless his possessions, accept the work he does, but crush his enemies hip and thigh. Make those who hate him rise no more. And when we look at verse 9 there, it says, of his father and mother, he said, I don't know them. That's actually referring to like the golden calf incidents back in Exodus chapter 32, because Levi did not regard his family ties. He killed those, regardless of who they were, that worshiped the golden calf. In Exodus 32, I'll go to that verse. Exodus 32, down to verse 26. It says, Moshe stood at the entrance to the camp and shouted, whoever is for Yah, come to me. And all the descendants of Levi rallied around him. He told them, here is what Yah, the Elohim of Israel, says. Each of you put his sword on his side and go up and down the camp from gate to gate. And every man is to kill his own kinsman, his own friend, and his own neighbor. The sons of Levi did what Moshe said, and that day 3,000 people died. Moshe had said, you have consecrated yourselves today to Yah because every one of you has been against his own son and against his own kinsman in order to bring a blessing on yourselves today. And so Yeshua, seems to be addressing that same kind of loyalty in the book of Luke. If we go to Luke chapter 14, and I'm going to go down to verse 25. It says that large crowds were traveling along with Yeshua, and turning, he said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father, his mother, his wife, his children, his brothers, his sisters, yes, and his own life besides, he cannot be my Talmud. And, hate's such an intense word and probably makes most of us squirm a bit, but its meaning is different than the usual interpretation. Its use here is more comparing in a sense. You're loyal to Yeshua should make everything else pale in comparison. Because if your parents or your children insist that you have nothing to do with Yeshua, then you must disregard them. Their wishes, not them, but their wishes. It's not an excuse to walk away from your family responsibilities, but it's about remaining faithful to the one who's called you. So that loyalty is, regardless, is important to Yah. So next we'll go down to verse 12, Deuteronomy 33:12. We go to Benjamin. Of Benjamin, he said, Yah's beloved lies securely. He protects him day after day. He lives between his shoulders. That seems like odd because Yah lives between his shoulders. Well, Benjamin is interesting of all of the tribes because Benjamin was the only one who was actually born in the land of Israel. Okay. The others were not born in the land. They were born outside of the land. And so here is the first one we actually have that's born in the land. And the temple itself in Jerusalem is actually located in Benjamin's territory. And, when you look at how it's laid out, it's like their shoulders, the place where the temple is, Jerusalem, is between the shoulders. So it is actually that it's saying Yah lives between his shoulders. Well, where he's putting his presence and his temple is there in the territory that looks like between the shoulders. Now we go to the next verse, 13. We start the blessing for both of Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, because they're both grouped together here. So of Joseph, he says, may Yah bless his land with the best from the sky, for the dew and for what comes from the deep beneath, with the best of what the sun makes grow, and with the best of what comes up from each month, with the best from the mountains of old, and with the best from eternal hills, with the best from the earth and all that fills it, and with the favor of him who lived in the burning bush. May blessing come upon the head of Joseph, on the brow of the prince among his brothers. His firstborn bull, glory is his horns are those of a wild ox. With them he will gore the peoples, all of them, to the ends of the earth. These are the myriads of Ephraim. These are the thousands of Manasseh. And so Joseph's blessing clearly speaks about bounty here. It appears that Joseph is going to basically bear the responsibility for all of the bounty, the backbone of Israel's economy. And remember, this is exactly what Joseph did when he was in Egypt. He was the one who provided for the survival of the 12 tribes. And so, for without Yah allowing Joseph to be in Egypt, Israel wouldn't have survived. And today, we see that, many of Joseph's descendants are in the West. And what nation has been the backbone for Israel's economy, helping to fund a lot of their military aid and supplies and things that they need for their own survival and to provide them with resources? America. So it is that same principle that's been applied even in our times. Now, I also love the last part of verse 16 there, where it says, may blessing come upon the head of Joseph, on the brow of the prince among his brothers. And it sounds sort of elusive, and it can be translated different ways. I'm going to read it out of another version. It says, let it come upon the head of Joseph and on the crown of the separated one. Actually, it uses the word Nazir, of his brothers. And I believe, that the Hebrew holds more of the meaning here. And notice that there are two things that are really happening in this verse. The blessing that comes on the head of Joseph and on the bowed, crowned head of the Nazir. So the word for Nazir is the one who is separated from his brother. So, to be separated. And so to me, this is pointing to, a picture of Yeshua being the one who is separated from his brothers, that he would be found amongst the tribe of Joseph here, that Joseph, the tribe of Joseph, is going to hold within it a picture of this king in it, Yeshua. Now, if I go to verse 17, I'm going to start here. It says, his glory is like the firstling of his bullock, and his horns are like the horns of unicorns. With them he shall push the people together to the ends of the earth, and they are 10,000s of Ephraim, and they're 10,000s of Manasseh. And so, when I read this in the King James, something struck me as odd because when I think of unicorns, I think of these like magical creatures with wings or whatever. And in Hebrew, the word that's used here for unicorn, the way the King James writes it, is re'im. It is actually used 9 times in Scripture. Ram is used in context of like familiar animals. They behave like ordinary animals. They skip like calves, bleeding. And I believe that, that unicorn came into our English translation due to some interpretations from maybe the Greek Septuagint, because it's called an animal with one horn. And in Greek mythology, the unicorn was a one-horned animal that it's believed that they could only be captured by a virgin, and that she would be able to trap them with her charms in order to get this horn, and that it held magical powers, and that the unicorn became, actually a symbol for the incarnate, and many religious art pictures intertwine. I'm sorry. Okay, so they intertwine the incarnation of Christ and the Virgin Mary with a unicorn which cradles, its head in Mary's lap. And there's actually, a whole bunch of, pictures that you can look at, and I will just share my screen very quickly just so that you can see some of these pictures. Oops, sorry. Try that again. There we go. And so you can see here, these are actually some pictures, and that's supposed to be Mary cradling, the unicorn. So I think a lot of that comes from that imagery. And that a lot of that interpretation is because of, the Greek there. And the Septuagint, when you really look at the Septuagint, it calls the reem a one-horned animal. And the Greeks, like I said, are familiar with the unicorn, so that's where it came in. But there are other one-horned animals out there that aren't unicorns, like rhinoceros and a narwhal. Those are both one-horned animals. And in Hebrew, when we think about the horn is a symbol of power. So really, this verse is, in a way, talking about the power of Joseph in battle. And remember, it was a descendant of Joseph, the tribe of Ephraim, that actually led the children of Israel into battle and conquest the promised land under Joshua. If we go to Numbers chapter 13, we're going to go down to verse 8. It says, from the tribe of Ephraim, Hoshea the son of Nun. If I go to verse 16 in chapter 13, these are the names of the men Moshe sent out to spy out the land, and Moshe gave to Hoshea the son of Nun the name Yahashua. And then, so we actually see them going out with this power too. And so, like I said, a lot of this I think is, symbolism, but when we're reading it, sometimes we read it and we're, reading it with our mindset, and we look at it and interpret it in the ways that we understand. And some of it, that's filtered down through some of our translations. Now we get to verse 18, Deuteronomy 33:18. Of Zebulun, he said, rejoice, Zebulun, as you go forth, you and Issachar in your tents. They will summon peoples to the mountain, and there offer righteous sacrifices, for they will draw from the abundance of the seas and from the hidden treasures of the sand. So Zebulun's military prowess was going out of his territory, because Zebulun actually was situated on the sea, and they were known for going out in their ships, and basically thus they were the gateway to the foreign trade with other nations. Now Issachar was also here to facilitate, and their land was in the area of the Jezreel Valley, which is in the heart of what is called the Via Maris, or the ancient trade route that connected Egypt with Mesopotamia. And so Moshe anticipates that their alliances and their relationships were part of their goals, the long-term goals of Israel. Now, in Deuteronomy 32:20, of Gad, he said, blessed is he who makes Gad so large, he lies there like a lion, tearing arm and scalp. He chose the best for himself when the princely portion was assigned. When the leaders of the people came, he carried out Yah's justice and rulings concerning Israel. And once again, Moshe's blessings are focusing on that unique nature of each tribe. And so Gad's initiative here is to widen his inheritance. And, Gad was situated in the Transjordan, and as well as their military capabilities. And then we go on to verse 20, I'm going to skip 22 of Dan. He said, Dan is a lion cub leaping forth from Bashan. So Dan is compared to a lion's offspring, which again is a metaphor for their military might. And his territory is listed, is actually listed here as Bashan. And Bashan is actually an ancient name for the Golan. And today, when we think about Dan's area is in the area called Dan, Tel Dan, and the Hula Valley. And in the Hula Valley, we went and visited the old Syrian Buckards there from the war. And even though the Golan actually belongs to Manasseh, Dan's location here at the border was to stand guard like that lion. Deuteronomy 33:23 of Naphtali, he said, You, Naphtali, satisfied with favor and full of blessing from Yah, take possession of the sea in the south. Again, Moshe's, when you look here again, Moshe's blessing that is to this agricultural potential for their inheritance. Because Naphtali's land is very fertile. It is a beautiful region in the upper Galilee, to the west in the south of Tel Dan. It includes like Zaphat and Mount Meron. And so it is a very beautiful area. It's very fertile. Lots of crops and things can be grown there. In verse 24 of Asher, he said, May Asher be most blessed of sons. May he be the favorite among his brothers and bathe his feet in oil. May your bolts be of iron and bronze, and your strength last as long as you live. So Asher's inheritance here was the abundance of olive trees, hence, the olive oil here, the oil. And its location was on the northern border. And Asher really guards the country's northern border. And it's like he's supposed to be like the iron lock that's securing the country. Now, like I said, I'm not going to go through every one of those, but I just wanted you to get an understanding too, I think, of why I'm looking at this with the aspect that, when you look at the order here, it is, I believe, linked with how they're coming into the land. And it's all about how you're going to survive in this territory and what each tribe is going to end up doing. And so this is Moshe's blessing of them coming into the land. Now, we, are missing Shimon. We've discussed, that Shimon's had troubles before. Remember that Yaakov was very negative in his blessing when he gave it on his deathbed over Shimon and Levi because they just murdered and slaughtered the men of Shechem. And this happened, let's go to Genesis 49. This happened after their sister Dinah was raped. So in Genesis 49 and verse 5, Shimon and Levi are brothers related by weapons of violence. Let me not enter into their counsel. Let my honor not be connected with their people. For in their anger they killed men, and at their whim they maimed cattle. Cursed be their anger, for it has been fierce, their fury, for it has been cruel. I will divide them in Yaakov and scatter them in Israel. So Shimon and Levi are both the recipients of this blessing from Yaakov, which is more like a curse than a blessing. But Levi, sort of redeemed himself because after the golden calf, he went out and he did what was needed and is like showing repentance there. But both of these tribes ended up being scattered in Israel. Levi had the Levitical cities, but when we look at Shimon, they're also scattered. And so, in those territories, um, and Levi, didn't really receive any land. They didn't have a tribal, territory, but they were rewarded for their faithfulness because they stood with Moshe after the golden calf, and so they were giving these individual cities. Now, um, again, like I said, Moshe begins with Yehuda's portion, and in the southernmost region of the land, he works his way up to the north through Benjamin to Ephraim and Manasseh. And so I look at this. This is why it explains why Benjamin precedes Joseph, because in this inheritance, this Morashah, it is located the north of Yehuda, but south of Ephraim. And, this, I think, provides us a clue as to why there is no blessing for Shimon, because, Shimon is actually the land that's given to him is encircled by Judah. So this, like you've got Judah's area, but within that, there's a little circle that is Shimon's area. So it is, so when you're going through and he's giving this blessing, it is not really worried about Shimon because it is enclosed within Judah. Also, in the aftermath of the sins of the sin of the sons of Moab, Shimon's numbers were severely reduced. And it's, a lot of people conclude that they probably didn't have a large army and didn't really play a major role in the conquest of the land. And one last thing here, I know this is a short little portion. It is just really the blessing here. And I'm not going to go through all of the tribes, like I said, but I did want to circle back because one of the things that this was about what Moshe was instilling in them coming into the land. And as we read the end of chapter 34, we stop there and we tend to think that that's it. But in traditional Judaism, the portion actually cycles back to Genesis 1:1, and chapter 2 is also chapter 2 to verse 3 is also read with this. And it is a picture to show us or to demonstrate to us that this Torah cycle doesn't end. It is just, we are continuously learning. He doesn't say that, here we go and we've got, here we're on this earth and we are going through this and now we've got it. It is a process and we're starting over every time. And he is trying to show us that he is there with us every time. And it is it's a cycle for him. It is, we tend to think of time very linearly, and it's not. It's very cyclical, and that he is showing us that you're not done with me. I'm not done with you. It's time to start again. And so, yes, we all may have made mistakes in this past year. We may have done some things that we shouldn't have done. But it is time for you to start over, just like every day. We can start anew and start fresh. The same thing goes with the Torah cycle. So as we finish out this year's Torah cycle, and we come to this wonderful blessing of them coming into the land, but we know we have a new beginning starting over again until we get into that eternity where it is every day a new beginning. And so I wanted to leave you with that because that was something that just really struck me with this, because a lot of times we think, oh, we're finished with the Torah cycle and done. But it's not. It is a restarting, and it is something that is to encourage us that it starts over again. So may you be blessed on this Shabbat evening that is coming up for the last day, and we will start over for the new cycle on the regular weekly Shabbat, starting back at Bereshit in Genesis 1. So may you have a great day. May Yah bless you and keep you, and Shabbat Shalom.